About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts.
I've improved by a whole grade.
I've improved
By a whole grade.
by a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
My teacher isn't just Mr. Maddock. It's a whole teaching team made up of James, Mike and Marta.
My classroom's all about doing and applying. My days standing at the front of the classroom with a PowerPoint are long gone.
I master every concept by learning at my own pace.
I spend 100% of my class time interacting and supporting individual students.
I move on only when the moment is right for me, not the whole class.
I know what each and every student is mastering and struggling on at every moment.
I know exactly what I need to learn next, and I can go back and review material at any time.
I spend my teaching time supporting and inspiring, not planning, delivering and marking.
I can learn from anywhere at any time.
I can switch off when school closes, knowing they are learning from the best.
My teacher has my homework marked before I get to class.
I set every piece of homework at the start of the year.
I'm 2 weeks ahead of my expected progress.
I can track everyone's progress with a swipe of a finger.
I can track my own progress and set my own targets.
I now have time to focus on developing the skills of every learner in my classroom.
I know exactly what it means to explain, evaluate and analyse, and I'm not afraid of any exam.
My lessons are now far more about the skills and the application, not just the content itself.
I've completely remodeled what it means to be a teacher in my classroom.
Good afternoon, everyone. James here. It is, let me get this right, it is Tuesday, the 8th of May. It is approximately 6 o'clock, a minute 2, something like that. We're about to start. We've got a really busy session here. And perhaps most important to say, first of all, is it's super hot where we're broadcasting from. So it's probably warm where you are too if you're based in the UK. Well, here it is super, super warm, and we've got all the windows and doors closed. So if sometime later on I have a bit of a glaze on my forehead, you have to forgive me, because I may be getting a little sweaty within the session, so forgive me for that. A couple of instructional things, first of all. Firstly, and most importantly, do please subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's really important you do that. Please support us by doing it. Small like for you, very important for us. I keep saying it. It makes a difference, so please do that. Secondly, you may notice some sound differences or volume level differences as we go through the session today. Now, why does that happen? We actually switch between microphones as we do different things within the session, so please be prepared just to adjust your volume. Thirdly, it's really important you've got the notes pages available to you. If you haven't got them already, they're just down there in the description. If you're in a classroom, probably very likely your teacher's already given them to you. You need to have the notes, and you need to have available the example questions, which we're going to demonstrate some answers to today, but also that you can have a go at answering yourself, which is really, really important. Now, that brings me on to some interactive stuff. We would like you to do two things, really. First of all, you might choose to interact with us over some questions. So my colleague Marta, who's controlling the show for us today, is going to talk us through how to do this.
So, hello. So to take part in and fill in one of our interactive questions, all you need to do is go onto our website, EverLearner.com. Then you just need to click on News, go on to Interactive Questions, and here you've got the list of all the interactive questions available. And today's
Emergence
session is... Sorry, James?
Sociocultural Session 3, Emergence.
Here we go, Emergence. I never find these. There are too many. So here we go, Emergence of History and Sport, and this is the question that you're very much encouraged to participate on. And
Indeed.
Don't forget to click Submit.
Great. Well, so that's that. That's how you do that. Now, sort of extending on from that point, you will have times in the show today where we just take a moment to move between Canvas and the studio and the camera. So you've got time to fill out the questions on your document, on your notes page as well. You should be doing that. But we also want you to have a bit of fun with us this afternoon, or this evening, I should say. So can you please have a look at this slide that Marta's going to put up here for us? And it shows you guys how you can send us a photo or a tweet or a Facebook post or whatever, and you can send it to us with the hashtag #RevisionBreak, and we will pick that up. And if your tweet is appropriate, we will feature you in the stream and give you a little shout out, guaranteed, later on. And don't forget that the best example of someone that sends us a little photo of what they're doing, we are going to incorporate that, or we are going to award that with as a competition winner for a pack of the roadmaps for that student, and that's going to help you a lot with regard to your exam preparation. So those are the key things from me. Marta, I think what that would suggest therefore is that we are pretty much ready to go. So if you give me sort of the nod, and I'm ready to go when you are.
So one of the really kind of emblematic things that we can do with our pre-industrial sport or our emergence history of sport is that we can make a comparison, or we can look at distinctions between two different types of activities that would have been involved or would have been taken part in at that time. And there's probably nothing more emblematic than the comparison between these two activities. So we're looking at some notion of a comparison between mob football and real tennis. Now, I've highlighted the concept of social class, which is central to an awful lot of you with regard to your studies on this particular topic, but I'm also going to be looking at things such as literacy. I'm also going to be looking at things such as gender. I'm also going to be looking at things like transport and communications, amongst other factors. And we could also look at things like wealth or disposable income, and how there's an L there, believe it or not, and how these things have influenced how these games were played and remain still played today, in truth. So, if you're unsure of what mob football and real tennis are, I haven't included those sort of quintessential, typical images within this little presentation. I would encourage you to go and Google them. If you're on a computer now, Google real tennis, Google mob football, and you'll come up with some kind of intriguing images. I'm not going to bother with that here because I'm just going to assume that you've seen them before. But what I am going to do is I'm going to describe these concepts in relation to social class. So let's take mob football first of all. How do we describe this pre-industrial form of kind of invasion game? Well, let's first of all make sure we know it's an invasion game. Modern invasion games would be things like rugby, netball, basketball, association football, and so on and so on. Those are our modern versions, and it's what we would call a force-based game. Now, here we have an interesting concept. A force-based game represents the social class which is playing it, and it's the first indication that we might be looking at distinctive groups between the two areas. Because the game was force-based, we can be pretty confident it reflected the participants being the working class, or you can use the term the lower class. I'm sure you could probably use the peasant class as well and have completely acceptable correct marks for that. So working class or lower class. Working class really is a term that became more typical in the 19th century through numerous methodologies, not nearly the sort of the internal situation of migration into urban sort of factory dwellings. We'll talk about this a bit later on. But it also, if you look at the works of Karl Marx, for example, this had significant influences in how we refer to these groups of people at different times. Anyway, so lower class or peasant class or working class, all of those would give you a reasonable distinction. Now, real tennis, of course, is kind of different. First of all, it's what we'd call a refined game. Now, yes, you can call it a net wall game, a refined net game. I meant to write a refined game, Now, that brings us back to mob football, because mob football wasn't just an invasion game, it's what we call a mob game. Now, that's obvious because it's got mob in the title, okay? So we've got this mob game or this invasion game. We have this refined game with real tennis. And this game is what we would call skill-based. So again, think that represents the social class that was participating in this. And of course here we are talking about the upper class. You can use the term gentry. You could even use the term aristocracy. You could even go further and talk about the landowning aristocracy and so on and so on. So the nature of the sport as participated in reflected the social class of the people who were taking part in it. And we see that straight away. Let's go back to our mob football for a second. We can describe it as violent and rowdy. Okay, more of which in a second. We can describe it even as dangerous. Okay, and we can even say that this was kind of reflective of the lifestyle of people of the time, sort of as death the feature of life. Give for example that the people playing this game would have slaughtered their own animals. Think about how that would differ from today, for example, where we have a very sanitized experience of life, where we tend not to see blood and gore day to day, unless we're on computer games, of course. And then what we tend to find here is in this group of people, the sports represented that kind of gory nature to life. Now, I'm not saying what is right and wrong within that, you make your own judgments, but it sort of was reflective of that way. Now, on this real tennis side, we've got what we'd call civilized, and I must put that into inverted commas because civilization is, of course, a subjective concept. So it was a civilized, or what we might call a respectable game. We could say, of course, it was non-violent. I mean, it's a fairly obvious point to make, but this again reflected the social class in which that was taking part in it. Now, mob football had simple, unwritten rules. Okay, think about how that represents literacy levels of the people that were taking part in it. Whereas our real tennis had what we often call as complex rules. Complex rules. Okay, so very complex. I mean, today I've read a bit of the rules of real tennis. I don't completely understand it. From what I can figure out, it's a combination of squash crossed with that ITV quiz show, The Chase. That's my personal interpretation of it. You make your own. But we've got this notion of this complex rule base. Now, again, you can use the term codified. Now, I think in terms of real tennis, codification is a bit of a misleading notion because it was more a set of rules by agreement, by education, rather than sort of a formalized governing body at this point that was decided upon this. Now, other points that we really should make here is that mob football was played in natural facilities, over fields, through rivers, over brooks, and so on. So this natural facility would have been a characteristic of mob football, whereas in the real tennis example, we have a specialised facility, and of course we can call that a court. Okay, so think about, this applies to rules as well, think about the notion of the didans. I'll put these things in inverted commas. Think about the grill. Think about the penthouse, not the magazine, thankfully. So we have these concepts, these specialized nature, specifically built courts, so specific, so technical, so advanced that you find them literally in royal houses. Hampton Court is often the example which is cited, but others as well. So we have this highly complex game. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is the notion, I always want to spell this word wrong, that here we have an occasional game. So mob football was occasional. We can say that it was played on religious holidays. Okay, so let's take let's take something like Ashbourne mob football. It was played twice a year, on Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday. If we look at Kirkenwall mob football, it's played on, let me get this right, Boxing Day and New Year's Eve, for example. We get these religious holidays as a result of the working conditions and the tendency to be working for that lower class, whereas our real tennis is what we would call frequent. Now, some people argue that real tennis is seasonal, so I'll let you use that term if you want to. Seasonal in the sense that it's an indoor sport, okay? But it's frequently played, and it's frequently played because the people that played this had time to do so. Now, I just want to touch on gender. Mob football was men only, representing kind of notions of masculinity and force and strength. And real tennis, it is argued by proponents of real tennis that it was played by both men and women. But things I've read about this suggest that it was really predominantly participated in by men, and it was part of almost like a chivalric code, the importance of a man at this time to be gallant, to be physically capable, but also to be romantic, to be academic, to be intelligent. It was part of the chivalric nature, and it was seen as a manly pursuit, even though it was skill based. So that's kind of an interesting concept that in another context we'd explore much further. So that gives us a bit of a picture. I want to be clear here. Note that I have not talked about mob football and said something like no distinction between players and spectators. I want to stick to the idea that we're discussing here social class. We've touched on literacy, we've touched on gender. Transport, now that's an interesting one actually. Do let me put that one in. These games here were isolated, okay, in the sense that each set of mob football was unique, whereas with our real tennis, this was international. Okay, so it was played, especially in Europe, especially in France and Britain, it was played internationally, and there was a combined set of rules. So that represents the notion of transport availability for different groups of people. And of course, in terms of wealth, this real tennis would have been particularly exclusive and expensive, and this mob football would have been much more accessible for people with little. So let's look formally now at the characteristics of popular recreation. And let's be clear about the word popular. We mean of the populace, of the people. All right, so let's go through this. We've already looked at the violent and rowdy nature of this, and we know that this is because it represented the harsh lifestyle that people experienced in pre-industrial times. We know that popular recreation was simple, unwritten rules, which for some reason won't come out of my mouth, because of illiteracy rates being so high. Illiteracy meant that sports didn't need to be codified. There wasn't the connection and communication to achieve that anyway, but simple unwritten rules passed down by word of mouth and experience were much more functional because people weren't literate on the whole. Sports were localized because we had, of course, lack of communications and transport. So sports remained localized, or what we tend to call isolated and unique. Sports were natural. Okay, we can represent this by the idea of low technology. Okay, low technology. So sports tended to take on the natural features of the surrounding environment. A great example would be swimming would be done in rivers. I mean, it seems fairly base really when we talk about it that way, but it's an obvious point. Wagering simply means betting, and the idea of this was that people like the idea of going from rags to riches, or if they were wealthy people and they loved to gamble, they could show their status. It was rural. Why? Because we had an agrarian lifestyle in pre-industrial times. In other words, people lived in the countryside. Courtly and popular is represented by what we call the feudal system. In pre-industrial times, we had a two-class society, the lower class and the upper class, and the sports represented that. They were either played by the courtly or they were played by a popular, and there are a handful of examples that were played by both. Okay, an example of that would be something like pedestrianism, more of which in a moment. Sports were occupational. Okay, they developed from somebody's job. Okay, again, pedestrianism is a really good example of that. Rowing would be another. And finally, sports were occasional, and this represents for the lower class the lack of time. But don't forget our exception of real tennis and other refined sports and some field sports as well that were far more frequent because people had the time in this courtly group. Okay, nice. Let's have a look at some questions. Now, we've got a question here. It says, question 1, Tom plays tennis. That's pretty much our only link to Tom. Explain why. Well, we know already that if we explain why, we're using words such as because, we're using things like this means, we're using things like therefore, comma. This is going to emphasize the fact that we're explaining why. There are other examples, but to give us a start. So explain why real tennis was an exclusive game in pre-industrial Britain. So why was it exclusive? Why was it, we could put it in these terms, why was it courtly only rather than courtly and popular or just popular? So what was the reason for that? Now, I made a bit of a mess up when I was preparing this, so I've had to stick a whole layer over the top of this because I kind of messed it up a little bit and then put it in. So things changed there a little bit, didn't you? So let's have a look. Why was it exclusive? This is because it relied on specialized, dedicated space, and I've got specialized, dedicated space. Okay, and specialized, dedicated equipment. Maybe I ought to get a second mark for that one. Let's be generous. Okay, so we could give examples there of rackets, balls, nets. We could obviously talk about the court there, and this is only available to the upper class. Furthermore, the game had complex written rules. Therefore, comma, it was inaccessible to the illiterate working class. Okay, would we get another mark for that, or is that connecting those up? The game required lots of free time to build skill. Okay, we've got skill-based. This means it was not possible for the working class. Finally, the game was expensive. And I think that was a 6 marker, wasn't it? Oh, was it 8? What am I doing? I got my max already. Apologies, folks. In my mind, I thought I had a 6 marker there, but it was 4 marks. So the last 2 I didn't really need, but I've got more than enough here. This means the working class could not afford it. So I'm clearly explaining why. I'm clearly using my explanatory language, and I'm clearly including key answers within that context. Okay, so a nice answer explaining why. So we're saying specialized and dedicated space and equipment. We're saying complex written rules. We're saying that meant illiterate lower classes couldn't participate. Lots of free time needed to build skill, and it was expensive. Okay, so some nice answers within that, but clearly I am explaining why. Now, if you feel you're rushed in terms of noting my answer down on your page, don't worry about it. First of all, return to this later and you can get a more detailed answer down. But the other thing is, have a go at answering this yourself. Okay, have a go at answering this yourself. You don't necessarily just need to use my answer. Have a go at answering this yourself. Okay, question. Mob football reflected the class structure, educational levels, time and transport availability of pre-industrial Britain. Evaluate this statement. So basically, if we're evaluating a statement, we're arguing, is it true or untrue? Okay, that's our main argument here, and we should at least at times look at both sides of that argument because we're evaluating it. So we must look, did mob football reflect class structure, educational levels, time and transport availability of pre-industrial Britain? We've got to evaluate that. So let's have a little start on that. Mob football partly represented the two-class feudal system by being working class only. However, the upper class had no involvement. Okay, so we're getting a mark there for putting the other side. So we're saying, yes, it represented the feudal system because the lower classes played it. But no, it didn't represent the whole feudal system because it was only played by one of those classes. So I'm evaluating the statement. I'm saying to what extent is it true. Next statement. Oof, big loads of it. Mob football represented the illiteracy of the working class by having no uniform written rules. Okay, and I'm saying on the other side here, as literacy rates improved in the 19th century, the game was codified. So I'm kind of looking at the other side of the argument there. There was very little transportation available. So mob football variations remained isolated. So there's my mark. And they were unique. The working classes worked to the agricultural and church calendar. So mob football was played on religious holidays. Nice. I get my mark there. I think I've got one more little area here. Here's when we're evaluating something, we really should conclude our point. In conclusion, comma, the statement is true in relation to the working class, but untrue for the working class. So we've got a completely legitimate point there. So it did represent the lower class, but did not represent the upper class. So therefore, it is a partial representation of those groups. Now, we could go into more detail on each of those points. We could say the upper class did have transport available. The upper class did have free time. The upper class did, for example, have high levels of literacy by attending those traditional, what's the word I'm looking for, elite schools, such as Harrow and Eton and Shrewsbury and Charterhouse and so on and so on. So we could take that point a little bit further. But we have a nice answer in there. Again, notice the structure I've gone through. I'm arguing to what degree this statement is true, and I'm trying to give both sides of the argument.
Okay, and we are back. I think we have quite a few questions.
Yeah, we've got a few questions. Yes.
Fire away.
Right. The first thing I wanted to ask was about codification.
Mm-hmm.
You said when you were talking about real tennis, you mentioned that in that case codification wasn't necessarily written down by like a written down code written down by an organization. So is that the case for every sport, where actually the code doesn't need to be written down by an organization?
It isn't the case. That would be the exception. Whether it's a completely unique exception, I don't know. Whether there is singularly only one case where a very complex, refined game like real tennis was not formally codified until relatively recently. I think it is now. Well, it is definitely now. I think that as an exception would represent the social conditions in which that game developed. A very exclusive, very small number of people in a very privileged, educated position. But that being sort of a central feature of a code of life and a code of behaviour that would have been pivotal to that to those people. So I think I mentioned there sort of the notion of the chivalric code, and I think it kind of comes more into that way of being. It was not a formally agreed codified version. It was just that it was the only version, because from the outset it was an elitist tradition that would have been passed on. That's not to say nobody would ever have written the rules down. I'm sure people would have done, but it wasn't codified. It didn't go through an 1863 Cambridge meeting as the Football Association did, for example. It developed into a complex structure more organically than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Also, you were talking about the social role of sport between amongst the higher classes and the lower classes. Am I right in thinking that sport had a different social role in the two different echelons of society?
Yes. So in that upper echelon society, what we might loosely call sort of landowning gentry, aristocracy, upper class groups, sport would have been part of a set of behaviours which would have been seen predominantly as gentlemanly. I don't think that term gentleman actually would have been around at this time, but it would have been seen as chivalric, it would have been seen as manly, and it would have been a different definition of manliness to the one we perhaps conjure today of strong, sort of burly men. It would have been more of a combination of a letter writer, a poet. It would have been a combination of a sword, like a fencer type swords person, one who could ride a horse particularly well. Think of classic scenes from classic novels, and you might sort of get an image of this. And sport would have represented a feature of that behaviour. Whereas I think in the lower classes, I think it was much more cathartic, and I think it was much more representative of a kind of an escape type experience. And also, of course, it reflected and represented the society in which it existed by being relatively brutal, by being very physical, by being very force-based. So therefore, it would have represented a very different idea to that of the upper classes who were experiencing something different. But don't forget, there were meeting points. So I only touched on it there, but for example, let's take pedestrianism as an example. So this is the idea of race walking. It was occupational activity developed from a job into being these footmen would have become sort of racers, race walkers, for want of a better term. But they would have effectively been owned or coached or sponsored, or what we like to say patronized by the wealthy gentleman whom employed them. So of course there would have been great status in employing the best of that person, and then racing that person against others. And that's a pretty common format. Boxing operated in a similar way, although that's getting into post-industrial periods. We certainly would have found the same with rowing, for example, and a couple of other things as well. So that was a pretty common condition too.
Okay, and yeah, what you just mentioned about sports being occupational bring me to my last question, really, because you were mentioning about sports being occupational, being sort of almost deriving from a job.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering I was trying to imagine real tennis. What sort of job would that have derived from.
Okay, so that wouldn't. So that wouldn't be an occupational activity. So there are specific activities or specific sports that did develop from occupational type roles. Athletics, the messenger, the footman would have developed into sort of a race walker. Think of it like a marathon runner, if you like. Other ones would have been watermen, who operated before the advent of many bridges to cross open rivers like the Thames, the Tyne, the Tees, and so on and so on. So wealthy people would have employed a waterman to row them across to the other side. This is a very basic picture I'm giving you here. But that person, of course, was raceable in the sense that if wealthy person 1 and wealthy person 2 both have a footman, they can race each other, and that then led to a notion of competitive sport. And partly, at least, it can be seen as at least one of the forerunners to things like modern day endurance athletics events or modern day river-based rowing events, as another example from those watermen.
So am I right in thinking then that the upper classes wouldn't have taken part in those jobs that derived from occupation? They may have paid for a sports person
generally
to do that.
Generally, yes. Although there are examples of wealthy people or upper class people who would have seen the challenge of racing against these lower class professionals as part of a physical pursuit and a physical challenge pursuit. So that was common. It became much more common with the advent of the middle class, who very much enjoyed that possibility of in some cases, of performing against the working class professional. There were many exceptions to that, by the way, but in pedestrianism that did tend to happen. So yeah, so there we go.
Very interesting.
Yeah?
Fantastic. Yeah, it is.
Okay, good. That's one of the better forms of feedback I've had with this particular content area in the past. Most students tend to use different words to interesting.
No, it is. It's social, isn't it?
Well, it is
social. It's the
social.
sort of thing I understand a bit better.
Okay, but it is socially interesting. It does give you a context for the modern world. It does give you a context for the sporting environment in which we occupy today. However, I also find it very distinct from the sporting environment today as well. When you look what we've done recently, when we've looked at commercialism, for example, you're creating or globalization and commercialism. You're talking about a very different picture here to the one that we have today, and there's all kinds of reason for it, some of which we'll explore now.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant.
Okay.
So, shall we go for the second part?
Yeah, let's
look at the 1800s.
I can't wait.
Yeah, fantastic.
Let's go.
So let's go for it.
Okay, so the 1800s, or the 19th century, might call it. If you're on the OCR exam board, just realise here we're talking about what you guys study as post-1850 developments. Okay, so again, we're going to be looking at your gender, your income, your literacy rates, your transport, and these different factors in relation to what I want to start referring to now as rational recreation. Now, many times students have said to me, James, what does that mean, rational recreation? I don't understand the term. So when we talk about the concept of rational recreation, we kind of want to clarify that point first of all. For me, and the way I like thinking about rational recreation, is it's sport with a purpose. Okay, so it's sport with a purpose. You might think, well, what purpose? It's sport in the image of God. Now, this is obviously it from the perspective of an educated middle-class person in the mid to late 19th century. And finally, it's sport based on notions of fair play and sportsmanship. Okay? So from that comes out things like intrinsic value, okay? Playing for enjoyment, not winning. Being competitive for health and for personal development, not necessarily to win. Concepts which today, potentially to some at least, feel quite alien to the way that we've got sports structured in the modern era. Sport in the modern era is almost entirely focused, or high-level sport, I should say, is almost entirely focused on the idea of competition, and the greatest value is on winning. Reflect on that at some point in your life. Why is that? Is that right? Is that correct? Does it have to be that way? Now, if you start asking those questions really legitimately and thinking about potential alternative answers, you can come up with some kind of intriguing stuff. But anyway, enough of me rambling on down some blind alley. Let's look at the characteristics of rational recreation first of all. And we're really going to do this very quickly, because where I want to jump to is to this image over here as quickly as possible. So as we've said already, rational recreation was respectable. Okay, it was respectable in the sense that it was non-violent. It was respectable in the sense that it was accepted by the church, amongst other things. It's codified. Make sure you realise that codified means it had accepted rules, or what we call agreed rules, standardised rules. That's what we mean by that. It had regional, national and international fixtures. We even had intercontinental fixtures in things like Ashes cricket by the 1880s. Okay, so this was much closer to what we understand today as modern sport. Had purpose-built facilities. Think about that in relationship to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and what we mean by that is the Industrial Revolution produced many things: wealth, time for some, very little time for others, but it also produced technology, it also produced hardware. So therefore that Industrial Revolution allowed for purpose-built facilities to be developed. Fair play, we've talked about it already. We've got middle-class values in here. Control of gambling. The old way of wagering was prevented and a new middle-class structure was established. We have sports becoming urban and suburban. Why? Because people migrated to the urban environment. It was elitist. We can often use the term exclusive. Okay, we've just looked at the idea of exclusivity in our popular recreation real tennis. It was only for some. Some sports even banned people that worked with their hands, lower class people, working class people. Classic examples were things like athletics and swimming. And we also have the regularity of sport, and this of course represents the time that people had available in one particular group in society, and that group being the middle class. So what are the reasons for this? Well, look, we've got our respectability point. Where does that come from? It comes from middle class values. The middle class became wealthy through the process of the Industrial Revolution. They effectively emerged, blossomed, bloomed, exploded in number as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There was a middle class back in the feudal system days, but they were so insignificant in number, they were considered to be not even worthy of naming them. Okay, so there were so few bankers, there were so few professionals, there were so few legal people. It tended to be at the top of society and the bottom of society until this point. The codified point is a really fascinating one. So codification, at least part of the reason for that, was that this middle class had well-established business skills, and they used that business skills to form national governing bodies and to codify sports. Let's look at our regional, national, international competition. How can that be? Well, because we have the development of transport, we have the development of trains, we have the development of steam in terms of steam ships that could cross oceans, even traverse half of the planet from Australia or from England to Australia. So we have the development of this. And now it seems like an odd one for me to include, but we also have canals. And you might be thinking, come on, James, no one was travelling to a football away match on a canal boat. No, that is true. But the technology to build the facilities was travelling by canals, and that's why canals are important, really important actually, and we tend to overlook it. So the development of canals allowed for the movement of hardware from one location to the other, often from ports inland. Technology, we've already touched on this, technology enabled purpose-built facilities such as football stadia to be developed and to be built. The middle class, which emerged through this Industrial Revolution, they believed in a model of sport based on fair play. You will find this an odd concept when I explain it to you. But some team, let's take some football teams for example. There's a very famous example called the Corinthian Casuals. Well, they're now called, to be fair, that's their modern name, the Corinthian Casuals. They were called the Corinthians only to begin with. But the Corinthian Casuals, or the Corinthians, when they played in their association football in the late 19th century, if a foul was awarded to them, such as a player was kicked, or as they would have called it, hacked, which originally in football was allowed and was later banned, they would refuse to take that free kick, that penalty, that thing. Why? Not because they hadn't been fouled, but they did not accept that a true sportsman was capable of foul play. Just reflect on that for a second. They were so adamant about the nature of what it meant to be a sportsman is that they refused to believe that a sportsman would be capable of foul play. It's a phenomenal concept, and I encourage you to explore it in your mind. Now, control of gambling. How? Well, there was the development of the police force. If you want to have a look at the history of the Metropolitan Police, very much surrounded in this particular period of time, for example. I'm sure many of you have studied Robert Peel and those things. I'm not going to go down that road, but we have that concept as well. So we've got this simultaneous development. We've also got the notion of migration. Migration happened from the rural or the countryside to the urban. So, of course, sports likewise moved from the rural to the urban. We've got the notion of elitism. We had segregation in society, segregated by districts, by suburbs, by job, by dialect, by all kinds of things. And this was also elitism by segregation within sport. And I urge you to investigate things like the exclusion clauses, which I'm struggling to write, the exclusion clauses that were introduced in sports like athletics. We also have free time. Okay, so the regularity or the increased regularity of sport became possible because of the free time available for the middle classes. So, of course, this is a really interesting concept, that one group in society had wealth, riches and time, and the other poor buggers, the lower classes, the working classes, were in tremendously awful conditions producing that wealth. Now, that is looking at the picture purely internally to sort of like the British society. If we look at who was being manipulated and used over a wider distance, we come to some fairly awful conclusions, but I'm not going to get into that here. I think you guys probably know what I'm talking about. Now, we do want to think about the process of industrialization. Now, James, are you going to tell us a whole history of the Industrial Revolution? Definitely not. I've got about 4 minutes here, and that would take a little bit longer. But what we are going to talk about is two basic trends. So the main thing I want to get across to you guys is if we look between 1800 and 1900, imagine this is some kind of chronological development. What we find is from 1800 to 1850, we get a decline in participation. So this is what we call, this line here represents participation. Okay, participation. And what we get in the second half of the 19th century is we get an increase in what we call involvement. Involvement in sport. Involvement of sport. Okay, so something is happening in the second half. That's a 5 there, by the way. Something's happening in the second half of the 19th century that suggests that involvement in sport and participation is dramatically increasing. So therefore, we might at first glance want to say, well, this rational recreation thing, which was really at its peak by 1850, was very, very effective. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about the positive impacts of industrialization. Now, just accept from me that on this negative side, we have things like poor health and sanitation. We have low wages. We have urban conditions that caused all kinds of problems for people participating in physical activity that they could have done before in their rural settings. We have notions of machine time. We have a lack of holidays in this period. People only had 4 days off work a year, for example. So there were all these reasons that caused this decline in participation through the first half of the 19th century. But what I want to look at is, well, why did things increase and improve in the second half of the 19th century? So first of all, I want to represent the idea that time available went up. Okay, so there's a couple of points that we'd make here. People had more time. So we know that the middle class were wealthy and they emulated the upper classes in many ways because they had availability of time. But we've also got time increasing for the lower classes, for the workers. And for the workers, we really want to have a look at the notion of the Factory Acts. And these were passed between 1870 and the turn of the 20th century. And these Factory Acts introduced various things. So they meant that people worked half-day Saturday, for example. Saturday, half-day. There was also early closing on Wednesdays in many places. We also get the establishment of a maximum 12-hour day. Okay, so it might seem like an excessively long day to us these days, but it illegalized working people for longer. So we've got people in the latter half of the 19th century having gradually more time available. Now, the only point I'd make on that is that varies to whether the worker was skilled or unskilled. It was much, much, much earlier for skilled workers than unskilled workers. Now, so we've got more time. We've also got increasing health by the second half of the 19th century. Now, please do not think that we had some kind of utopian healthy society for working classes by 1870 or something. That's not the case. Cholera, dysentery were killing many, many people, but the situation was improving. Well, why was it improving? Well, we have the development of sanitation. Okay, it was a really important aspect. Think about a sort of a busy urban London having a sanitation system when it didn't before. Imagine what impact that would have. Secondly, with increasing health, we have the development of what we call public baths. And public baths are probably not what you think of them today, where you go to a swimming pool and you do a few lengths and maybe you jump about on some inflatables. Public baths, they did include swimming in the 9th century, but they were literally wash houses. And this developed by what we call the Baths and Wash Houses Act. Baths, I never remember how to spell this, Wash Houses Act. And this made it much more affordable for local towns to be able to build public baths within their districts. And of course that allowed people to have, they even went there to clean clothes, so they cleaned themselves, they cleaned clothes, they took exercise. This improved the overall general health of people in society. So time went up, health went up. We even have the increase in wages. Still not a fair system, but we have the increase in wages by the second half of the 19th century. And we also get the development of cheap spectatorship. So think about urban sports like association football, for example. They allowed people to then be able to afford to be spectators. I mean, regardless of playing for a moment, they were able to afford taking part in the watching of these sports, which of course initiated and supported the growth of association football clubs, soccer clubs at the heart of urban societies. Now, I'm not differentiating that from rugby. It would have done exactly the same thing, but football was the one that truly took off, I suppose. Now, we've also got here, if I put more time to point 2 here, we have the increase in public holidays. Okay, so we had more public holidays. So as a result of this, people had better wages, more public holidays. I'm going to talk about transport in a second. You even had people taking part in what we call excursion trips, visits to the seaside, even perhaps really primitive forms of water sports taking place, but certainly sea-based, river-based swimming would have been a classic example. So we have increased time again. Now, we have increasing transport. So by the latter part of the 19th century, we have a really well-developed railway network, and that increasing transport led to things like fixtures. Now, the way trains worked at this time, or the bigger trains, they would have, obviously they would have been steam powered, so coal burning, producing steam, but they would have allowed things like first, second, and third class seats. Third class seats would have been super cheap, or they would still have been. You'd still have to make a decision if you had these still increasing, still relatively low wages, but you could at least have a go at affording them. So this led to to fixtures. The transport as well led to the excursion trips as well. We want to talk about down there. The other point is, or one of our final points, is we have the development of what we call industrial patronage, or patronage, I've heard some people say. And this is the idea of factory teams. We also have church acceptance. So by the church recognizing the new rational form of sport as being valuable and developmental, this meant that we had the people on a moral, ethical level were accepted for taking part in these, the church acceptance. And of course, this even led to things like church teams. Now, on factory teams and church teams, I mean, use whatever examples that you like, but factory teams, you could talk about clubs like Arsenal, West Ham for football. You could talk about Aston Villa in football as well. So this church acceptance led to the development of church teams. So finally, on Industrial Revolution, we already know we get the growth in the middle class. Now, we're kind of just repeating a point here, but these middle classes needed to be educated. Okay, and they were sent to what we call Philistine public schools, copies of the elite schools, fee-paying boarding, all that stuff. And of course, what they developed in these schools was a love of what we now call today athleticism. Athleticism is the combination of moral discipline and integrity with physical endeavour, health, fitness, and so on. So that meant that these people coming back in society then spread their games further, more of which in some other tutorials we have. If you go and have a look at the EverLearner.com, it will get you an awful long way. So coming back to our original point, what are we saying here? Involvement increased in the second half of the 19th century, and here are many of the reasons why. Oh, how could I? Space. So space, which was an absolute premium in the early urban setting, we have the developments such as public parks and open green spaces within cities. This was something that was promoted a great deal at the time by Queen Victoria, the need for green spaces within cities, and she was a proponent and a supporter of that. And that space was developed in public parks. And of course, if you go to, say, London today, it's full of green spaces all over. It's a very urban place, but there's many green spaces there. And part of that was because we get the development of public parks within this 19th century period. Now, I have to quickly change my canvas because I've got my question on the next page. Just bear with me for 2 moments. Okay, final little bit for today. We have an explain how question. Now, for me, when I see an explain how, I straight away think about the language. Oh, what's happened to my pen here? Through and by. Okay, I've got a really much thicker brush stroke on this canvas for some reason. I'm not sure why that's happened. Anyway, get back to my point. Explain how. This is, you're describing or you're explaining some kind of process here. So you're going to say it happens through, it happens by. You could use via, would be another kind of really good example of using an explain how type structure or language. It's kind of really emblematic of that kind of answer. But anyway, explain how rational recreation represented the society in which it existed in between 1850 and 1900. So how was it that rational recreation represented its society? So let's have a little go at doing that. Look, and straight away I've got through its middle class values. Okay, middle class values of respectability. Now, I'm not sure if respectability is going to get me another mark, but I'm going to be generous to myself. I'm going to give myself both of those. Through the new transport networks, such as rail, it was national and even international. Next part of our answer. 1 second. Through the middle-class model of law and order. The games involved rules, fair play, and control of gambling. I'll come back to these points in a second. Through the new urbanized society, the sports were played in urban city hubs. And already we have our max. So all I'm doing there is I'm taking my characteristics of rational recreation. I'm just giving them a societal basis. Why was it that they were played in cities? Well, because of the process of urbanization. Look, why was it that the sports were codified? Well, it was because of the new business skills of the middle class. Okay, I've already got my max by then, but you take my point. Why did the sport become national and international? Because of the transport networks. Okay, so we've got more than enough there to get ourselves over the line. So I'm explaining how, through, by, via. Okay, so really important. Take your time with that when you come back to this recording. Have a look at that in a little bit of detail. Now, this question is for AQA only. Compare popular... Let me clarify that. If on your course you study both popular recreation and rational recreation, if you study pre-industrial and post-industrial sport, there's no reason why this question couldn't be asked. I think what we want to clarify here, AQA only, what we mean by that is that this comparison is specifically referenced on the AQA specification. So it's perfectly possible it's asked elsewhere, but it's specifically relevant to you guys on AQA. All right, let's have a look. So we're comparing popular recreation to rational recreation with specific reference to track and field athletics. Okay, so pre-industrial athletics involves smock races and strength events. Okay, we didn't touch on this here, but those guys, you guys do in AQA, you do. Whereas post-industrial had the codified extra-college structure. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, I'm comparing. There's my comma space, whereas it's a comparative statement. Pre-industrial athletics involves smock races and strength events. And post-industrial, we have the Exeter College rules. Okay, there's probably two marks for that. Let's look at our next statement. Pre-industrial forms mostly involved the working class. However, so I'm comparing, post-industrial was, I can't speak today, post-industrial was mostly middle class. Okay, I get my point there. Oh my goodness. Pre-industrial athletics was featured in rural festivals. Similarly, still comparing and finding similarities, post-industrial was an urban festival, exemplified by the modern Olympics. Okay, nice. So I get my max in that. I'm clearly performing the skill of comparison. When we compare things, folks, we say things like comma space, whereas. We say things like however, note capital, however, comma, similarly, comma. This is comparative language. Okay, so we're clearly saying this one thing is like this other thing is like this one thing was like this, however, this other thing was like this thing was like this, similarly, comma, this thing was also like this. So we're clearly comparing, and you guys should be in the habit of writing your answers in that format, in my opinion. So we're clearly comparing pre-industrial popular recreation athletics to post-industrial. We're clearly showing the skill of comparison. What's happening here? We're clearly showing that we're comparing things, and we pick apart marks as a result. So the image I'd like to give really of that is that if you know your knowledge well, the chances of you being able to nail the question increases significantly if you know what these words mean. If you know what explain how means, your knowledge, your possibility of answering this exact question dramatically increases as a result of an intuitive and good grasp of those concepts. And I can't urge that enough. Okay, let's go back.
Okay, super. Still hot in here.
It is boiling, yes.
Yeah, fire away.
Okay, my first question, James. You have spoken quite a lot about the conditions of the workers during the second half of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Time, disposable time in a way, went up, health improved, increase in wages and all that stuff. And everything was
really rosy, doesn't it?
And all that,
I mean, you have to remember the horror that came before and continued during that period. This is not a rosy picture.
No.
It's just slightly better than... can't use the word
rubbish.
Really bad. Slightly better than really bad.
All of that was due to the Factory Act.
Well, that was certainly significant.
So what was that Factory Act?
Okay, so the Factory Acts, they started as early as, let me get this right, 1933. So the initial...
19 or 18?
1833. So the original Factory Act, just to give the big picture here, the original Factory Act in 1833 was the legislation aimed at structuring working hours for children down to the age, I think it was down to the age of 5 and 6 years old. So you can start to get a feeling of what we're talking about here, unimaginable type conditions here. And the Factory Acts progressed to provide better working circumstances, better working conditions for different types of workers. It sort of went in this order. Children, they improved conditions for children at work, for women, then to more skilled manual labourers, then to partly skilled manual labourers, and then unskilled manual labourers. By about, I think it was 1901 was the Unskilled Manual Labourer Factory Act.
Which must have been the bulk of it. Must have been most of the...
Yeah, because you've got a pyramidal structure there. So the biggest group would have been the unskilled workers, and those Factory Acts have continued to be passed, I think, even until the 1960s, 1970s, and now incorporate things like health and safety regulations. But they tended to limit the working hours that people had, and they happened to limit working hours, particularly on a Saturday afternoon and on a Wednesday evening, which leads to midweek sport and Saturday afternoon sport, which is kind of why we're particularly interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Good. So it was a good thing then that these Factory Acts were passed. I suppose was it all done on the benefit of the worker? Was it for their sake, or
What do you think? Do you think this was altruistic?
I'm inclined to think that it wasn't, but
Okay,
maybe I'm wrong.
I'm gonna resist the urge to go down this one. It's quite a deep rabbit hole, this one. So Martha's question basically is, were these factory acts, so was this sort of an act of benevolence and altruism by the authorities and by factory owners, and people just wanted working class people to have better conditions? I mean, I'll just throw it back to you rhetorically. What do you think? What do you think is the answer to that question? So if you're really interested in that, I would encourage you to read the work of Ketterle, Galton and Taylor, all about that, because it answers that specific reason why these sorts of things happen. Now, it doesn't happen to be on this course, so I'm not going to go on about it, but it's a superbly interesting read if you want. So Ketterle, Galton and Taylor, if you're interested, go and Google that and find out a little bit about it. It's a staggeringly interesting set of ideas, and it basically comes from a value system, which was how can we get the most productivity out of the worker. Now, it happened to be the case that getting the most productivity out of the worker incorporated certain features which were allow the worker to recuperate, allow the worker some but limited time off. But it's all about the system of machinery and industrialization, which is ultimately the answer to that. Now, there were individuals who found the conditions of the late 19th century deeply cruel, and you may well be able to, you'll know of people like Dickens, for example, who wrote about this extensively. Read Hard Times is a classic example of that, but pretty much all of Orwell's work, I mean, some of his most famous work, think of Oliver Twist. How was it representing, sorry,
Did you say Orwell?
Oliver Twist?
Yeah.
I didn't say Orwell, did I?
Okay, yes.
Yeah. I don't think Orwell.
No, I know. That's why I
wasn't
wasn't.
Back then, he wasn't writing until the 30s,
I know.
so I don't think he. So if you look at works like that, you see how people like Dickens were representing the humdrum horror of working class life in the industrial urban city of the 19th century. So there was that side of life, that kind of benevolent. Philanthropic side of society, but in reality the majority of those changes were brought about for industrial purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So no, they didn't do it to be kind.
That's a shame.
Any other questions?
No, that's really all the questions I had.
Okay, great. Well, let's call things a day there. Can I remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's really important. We do appreciate it. Please do it. It makes a massive difference to us. We are back on tomorrow with our last socio-cultural session. If I really scrunch my eyes up, I might even be able to tell you it's Olympism and the Olympics at 4 till 5 tomorrow afternoon. And we also have a demonstration of the EverLearner.com tomorrow at, I think it's at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. I think that's right. And just in case you're a teacher out there, so you students, you can switch off now, but just in case you're a teacher out there, we have what I think are going to be our two biggest announcements we've ever made as an organisation are going to happen in the next 7 days. So start to look out for that, because in my opinion, that's going to be super interesting for everybody who's interested in the sort of similar things that we are. So all that being said, I think we're done. So Marta, I'm going to try and on the way home, I'm going to try and tempt you into the pub for a lemonade because it's hot today. You could be tempted.
Yeah, maybe a lemonade or a lime and soda. Yeah.
If I buy you a lime and soda, fancy that? Sort of sit in the garden. Kids they're at football practice, so we've got an hour.
I might even be risking go for a cola drink.
Go for a cola drink. Well,
just avoiding saying brands.
Yes, okay, go for a cola drink. I'm going to do something similar, and it's going to be a bit fizzy too. Okay, guys, all the best to you. Take care. We really appreciate you being here. Have a great evening. Take care.
The traditional classroom environment doesn't suit everyone. Students that don't fit this pace of learning begin to lose confidence. The problem is, the current learning model has holes in it. Luckily, the EverLearner.com is here to fill those holes. With the EverLearner Classroom, each student is given a chance to master each subject at their own pace. With thousands of video tutorials and tens of thousands of automated questions on the site, students can progress at their own individual pace. And because every interaction is tracked within the site, teachers can review students' progress and gain access to razor-sharp data. Teachers will have more time to engage with small groups and be better informed of where their time and support is needed. With the EverLearner, teachers can leave the traditional model behind and become facilitators, coaches, and inspirers. There's a reason we have over 100,000 registered students. To learn more, visit our website today.
Yeah.